All right, good morning. We have a very small showing today, so I suppose that lots of people are probably watching the live stream, although the viewers so far. But if you are watching the live stream and you want to participate in the class discussion and earn points, you can text me at 405-414-7054. So I'll give you that option. 405-414-7054 if you want to participate in the class discussion, get bonus points for the duck hunt. So we're talking about international marketing and advertising today. And I'm also going to this shouldn't take up the entire class period. I'm also going to discuss the IMC plan. So for the next 2 weeks, we won't be meeting in class. You have that class time to work on your IMC plan. And I'm going to talk about, if you haven't chosen your company, sort of 2 different approaches that you can take to completing that assignment. So you get full points for that, because I'm sure everybody wants to get full credit. So international marketing. In the past several decades, we've seen an increase in globalization. The world economy is something of relevance. And if I had taught this class, 50 years ago, I would have said that, the vast majority of companies are national or local, and you're probably not going to be involved in international marketing. But now, almost every single company has some amount of international trade associated with it, even local hotels. So for example, my family owns a number of bed and breakfasts in Guthrie, Oklahoma. We've been on ghost hunters and ghost adventures. And as a result of that, we have a huge number of people that have come from overseas. And when they come to America, they want to stay in haunted properties. I don't know why, but it's a big business, and they do ghost tours. They basically plan their vacation around. And so we've had people from Germany and the United Kingdom and most of Western Europe that have stayed at our hotel. Whereas historically, when we started in 1986, the primary source of our revenue was from people who came from Oklahoma City that just wanted a quick getaway, a weekend getaway with their spouse to come someplace different and participate in a murder mystery. And that's changed. A vast majority of our business now is no longer Oklahoma City. It's Dallas and Wichita and other travelers from other areas. So the balance of trade, the U.S. has a trade deficit. One of the areas where we have a trade surplus is in services. And so balance of trade issues are important in international marketing. Services, one area where we have a competitive advantage, the post-industrial economy. So we started out as an agricultural economy, like most societies do. And then during the Industrial Revolution, we rapidly industrialized and began mass producing goods for what were viewed as a homogenous society. And we've now moved beyond that to a post-industrial economy, where the real value in the American economy is no longer in tangible things, but in ideas and services that we provide: banking, insurance, legal type services. So we have a competitive advantage there, and we export a lot of that to other countries. When we talk about international, we have to do the same thing that we do in national marketing or regional or local marketing. We have to look at the environmental factors and do the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, the SWOT analysis that we have in our focus for national markets as well. So we have to look at things like the economic environment. When we talk about looking at these factors, the economic environment, are we talking about developed nations? So a vast majority of our goods and services are sold or marketed to other developed nations. What are the developed nations? Well, they're primarily Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Japan, and then developing nations such as China and India. There are now more billionaires living in Hong Kong than there are, for example, in the United States. But a vast majority of China is still experiencing developmental growth. And those products and services that we try to sell there are in many respects not, the infrastructure is not there. One of the things when Coca-Cola wanted to sell, for example, in the early era of exporting Coca-Cola to India, for example, they didn't have the infrastructure to provide for huge trucks to deliver Coca-Cola. How's Coca-Cola delivered in the United States? Well, it's delivered largely by semi-trailer, tractor-trailer rigs or large commercial trucking, and we deliver it in cases or pallets in the United States to places like Sam's and Walmart, and then they break those cases down. They didn't have that kind of infrastructure in India to be able to support that, and so Coca-Cola was delivered by mopeds into these rural areas. It's a huge difference in the way that we get goods and services to the consumer. So we have to look at the developing versus developed, looking at demographic information, income levels and distribution in the developing world, as opposed to what we used to call, and I have a bachelor's and a master's in political science, and when I started, we used to talk about sort of three worlds in political science and economic political economy. We talked about first world nations, second world nations, and third world nations. And those terms, particularly third world, have become pejorative. But the first world was the capitalistic societies. That was the United States and Western Europe. The second world were the communist countries and their satellites, sort of in Eastern Europe. And then there was everybody else, which was the third world. And now we call them the developing world. And there are lots of these economies that we now call newly industrialized countries, NICs. And we look at them in terms of developed versus developing now. So income levels and distribution. In the developing world, what you tend to see is a bipolar sort of class structure in many instances. In the United States, we think about ourselves, and when you ask people questions in the United States about class, first of all, Americans tend to say that there are no classes, which is just obviously false. But if we ask people what class they fall into, they'll say, well, we don't really have a class society, but I'm middle class. Overwhelmingly, people sort of tend to identify as middle class, even if they're not, even if they're enormously wealthy or they're in the poverty category. People tend to say I'm middle class. We have this huge swath of the population that has enormous purchasing power as a result of sort of the middle class distribution, whereas in other countries what you find is there's this bimodal distribution. There's a very small sort of upper class, and then there is this larger group of the poor. And how do you market to that? What are the income levels and distribution? In China, you see there's mass disparity between the wealthy and sort of everybody else. What are the ages, the education, the household size, and employment rates? One of the things that we've seen in developing worlds is we're graying. The United States is getting older as a population. The only thing that has kept us from becoming really an aging population, where you see this in Northern European countries, where the balance of population is tending to be older. The United States, the only reason that we don't have that sort of imbalance and tending towards really being older than we are is because of immigration. So we have this aging population in the United States. And why is that? One of the things that we face as a challenge here at UCO, for example, is the fact that there are just fewer students out there to come to college. After World War II, we had what was called the baby boom. And there were all of these people, and as a result of the GI Bill, they were going to college in record numbers. Historically speaking, college education was something that was really reserved for the elite. One of the things that we did in the United States is we sort of had this egalitarian ethic, and we increased the number of people who went to college after World War II with the GI Bill and other measures that made it affordable for everybody to go to college. When I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, for example, they decide fairly early on with a high stakes test, and I don't know if this is still true, but I'm going to guess that it probably is, whether or not you're going to be eligible to go to college. And if you are, you sort of go to a high school, which is called gymnasium, which is for those students that are going to go on to higher education. Everybody else is sort of put into a vocational type training program where they focus on just the sort of the nuts and bolts of what you're going to need to go out and get a job and work in the economy. That's not true in the United States. Everybody has an opportunity, even if you are not college bound, you don't take college prep courses in high school, you can always overcome that by going, for example, to junior colleges. Even if you don't graduate from high school, there are lots of people that get their GED, and my cousin was one of these. She dropped out of high school and went to work because she didn't think that college was for her, much to the horror of my family as a whole. But she realized later in life that college was sort of necessary, and she wanted to get a better life for her and her children. And she went back and she got her GED, and she went to a junior college and got the first 2 years, and then she went on and she got a BSN, a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing, and became a nurse. So there's always this opportunity in places like the United States for you to sort of make up for those past mistakes that you don't have necessarily in other nations. But what we do face, even though we have this immigration that's kept our age distribution somewhat more moderate than other places, is the fact that we have a large graying population, a large number of baby boomers, the biggest number of babies born in the United States to families, after World War II is aging, and they're leaving the workforce. As a result of COVID and the sort of pandemic, a lot of them are retiring even earlier, and it's created a huge gap in lots of things, which has led to problems, for example, in logistics. A huge number of truck drivers, for example, are just have left. They decided to retire early rather than, continue on in their profession. And there are these huge holes that we're going to have to fill. So do you have a relatively young population? In most of the developing world, they still have these relatively young populations because children are an economic asset. In the developed world, children become an economic liability. My brother always said I had no children. And my wife said she didn't want to have any children. And then after we got a divorce, she had like 4 children, which I guess means that she didn't want to have children with me, right? But there are lots of us that are choosing, I have no kids, so I'm not replacing myself. My brother always said he wanted to have 5 or 6. We grew up in a fairly small family. Although my mother married, my brother is actually my half brother. My mom married an FBI agent who had 3 older children. So we had siblings, but they didn't actually live with us. And they were pretty much grown by the time my stepdad is 13 years older than my mother. And so they were pretty much grown and out of the house by the time my brother and I came along. And so he always wanted to have a lot of children. That's what he said. Until he had one and he realized how expensive it was. And all of a sudden he didn't want to have any more children. And his wife talked him into having two, and they had them back to back. So they're actually Irish twins for about 3 weeks every year. They're the same age because they had like instantly had a second kid. But they're only replacing themselves. Lots of students that I have now come from households where they're the only child. When I was growing up, that was the exception, to have a household where you were the only child. Now that's becoming more and more the rule because kids are not an economic asset, they're an economic liability. But in the developing world, that's not necessarily true, where you have to have children to go out and work in the farms and the fields and things like that. What's the education level of the country that you want to target? Are they a highly developed, technologically sophisticated workforce like the United States, where almost everybody has access to internet? Most of us have this device that we can look up stuff, and this has become sort of a detriment in terms of socialization. How many of you have experiences where you're sitting at a table with your group of friends and somebody says something and instantly we're all fact checking everybody else, right? By going on Google and looking out. That's not necessarily the case in the developing world. So what's the education? What's the household size, and what are the employment rates? How much unemployment does the country have? That matters in terms of your ability to sell goods and services in those areas. Do you want to sell your goods in those kinds of areas, and what's the opportunity cost for that? Culture. This is a huge component of exporting your goods and services to other countries. Language is one of the biggest factors. Translation and back translation of your advertisement can lead to problems. And I'll give you an example. For example, in French, the word for bad is also the word for evil. And so you can have something that means bad in sort of an ordinary sense, and it could also mean evil. So for example, if somebody has a headache, they say, "J'ai mal à la tête." Mal is the word for evil or bad. They don't literally mean I have evil in my head, but they don't have sort of that distinction, which is odd because Americans, and English is one of the languages where we don't necessarily have varying degrees of differentiation. We say, for example, in the United States, not so much in Great Britain, we love everything. I love my car. I love my boat. I love my airplane. All of these things. And we don't mean that in the same sense as we love our spouse or we love our mother or father, right? We don't have that sort of distinction. And so these varying degrees of nuance can be problematic when you translate things into another language, if you don't understand sort of the linguistics of it. And so looking at the language, the customs. When Kentucky Fried Chicken wanted to go into Japan, the customs in Japan are far different than they are in the United States. In the United States, fast food is fast food. We pull up to the drive-through and there's, some underpaid employee who sort of takes your order at the drive-through and throws the bag out the window at you, and you're sort of lucky if the order is correct. One of the things that I absolutely hate, I have this friend who he insists on customizing his order for everything. And I'm like, this is going to turn out poorly, right? I mean, we were on a trip and we decided we were going to go to McDonald's because even though he hates McDonald's, it was the only place in like Clinton where we were getting gas that was fast and easy and convenient on the interstate to get back on the road. And he says, I want to go in because I want to order. So it's like, I want the sausage McMuffin with egg, but I don't want the egg. So the sausage McMuffin with egg comes with a poached, I'm going to put poached in quotations because it's like, I mean, it's something like that. But he didn't want that egg. He wanted the egg that comes on the one that's sort of scrambled. And again, I'm going to put scrambled. He's like, I want that, but I don't want sausage. I want bacon. And I'm like, oh God, this is like not going to turn out well, right? And it didn't. Like the order was completely wrong, and everybody else's order in our group was completely wrong as a result of the fact that there was just way too much confusion, right? And so, but we're used to that in the United States. We're used to, if you go to fast food restaurants, you understand that fast food is cheap, fast, convenient, although I sometimes wonder about how fast they are anymore. That's what makes McDonald's famous, is it's cheap, fast, convenient, and consistent. If you don't start with this, I want the Big Mac, but I don't want the special sauce that comes on it. I only want ketchup and mustard and no pickles. I mean, like if you start with this, like you just need to order off the menu or you're going to confuse them and they will never get it right. And we understand that. They don't get that in Japan. And in Japan, it's very important that you get not only the order right, but that you're sort of respectful. So they have this whole way that when KFC wanted to go into Japan, that they had to go about doing business and they had to learn about sort of the customs of Japan. So for example, in the United States, if you want to start a business, by and large, on the whole, for the most part, as long as you meet the legal requirements for the business that you want to start, you can open your business anywhere you want. And there's zoning requirements. For example, you can't go into an R1 designation, which is single family residential units, and put up your KFC. But you find a plot of land that's designated commercial, and you can go in and you can start your business in this designation, right? And as long as you meet the requirements in terms of you have to have so many, outlets of water so that you can wash your hands and do all of these things. And if you provide indoor dining, you have to have restrooms for people, and those have to have hot and cold running water with soap and all of these things that you're required to. You can do that, and you don't have to ask anybody. In the Japanese culture, when KFC wanted to go in, you have to go around to everyone in the neighborhood and basically ask their permission, all the other businesses, to go into business. You have to say, I'm going to open this business. Would you give me your sort of blessing to do that? That's antithetical to the American way of thinking, which is, I'm going to put my business in, and if you don't like it, and if it competes with your business, so what? If I can build a better mousetrap, good for me and bad for you, right? So understanding the customs, the tastes of people in other cultures, lots of things that we take for granted in the United States, they don't have in other places. Again, going back to customs, MGM, when they opened their casino and hotel in Las Vegas, the entrance to the property was the MGM Lion. So you entered through the mouth of this huge lion. As China has developed and they send more and more people to the United States on, vacation and tourism, the Chinese people will not enter through the mouth of a lion because it's bad luck. So they had to redo the entrance to their hotel to deal with those sorts of customs. The attitudes, the lifestyles. We're the only country other than Japan that really prides itself on hard work. And this idea that you have to work hard in order to get what you want. When I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, the father of the family that I lived with was he was the equivalent of what we would call a superintendent of public schools in the little town that we lived in. And he decided, and I was just sort of horrified, he came home one day and announced that he was going to have a nervous breakdown. Like, you don't just decide you're gonna have, like, he decided he was gonna have a nervous breakdown and he needed to go to the spa. And for the remainder of my time as a foreign exchange student, he was off at the spa having his nervous breakdown. Like, because he was just overworked. Now, I was horrified the entire time I was there because my father was an FBI agent, my mother was an entrepreneur, and like they went to work and they worked like, from 8 to 5 or more. My mother, who owned a real estate company and a land development company, that you work a lot more. He would go to work somewhere around 9 o'clock. He would leave the house and I guess get to his work, probably around 9:30. He came home every day at 11 for lunch, which lasted until 2. And that involved a nap. And then he went back to work until about 4:45 when he came home. And I'm like, what kind of stress could you possibly be under, man? But this is radically different. And so, as an example of this idea that, lifestyles matter, I had a colleague in the PhD program. Her name's Jennifer Zarzosa. She's now at Henderson State in Arkansas. And she worked before she went into the PhD program, Swirsky helicopters. And so they had this whole advertising campaign in the United States about, you want to buy your helicopter because you're the busy executive on the go and you need every minute. When they tried to duplicate that ad and that marketing program in Mexico and South America, it failed miserably because they just don't have the same sense of, you got to get there and go all the time. I mean, it's a whole different mindset that they have. And so these attitudes and these lifestyles and these values that they have, what it is that we truly enjoy are radically different in other parts of the world, outside the United States. Nobody works as much as we do except for the Japanese. In other countries, it's just, this idea is unheard of. They have huge amounts of, time off. In America, the standard is you get 2 weeks of paid vacation and that's it. And companies expect that you not take it. It's one of the reasons why I went back to academia after I had left UCO and become an executive vice president of a publicly traded company. My first day on the job, my boss said, now, you get 2 weeks vacation, but we expect that you never take it. And when I told him I was going to take an actual, like the entire time I worked there for 4 years, I never took more than a day vacation at a time, like a Friday or a Monday or something like that for a long weekend. And when my brother was getting married, I said, my brother's getting married, I'm going to take a whole week vacation. That is unacceptable. You cannot possibly take an entire week off. And I'm like, well, I'm going to. And he's like, no, you're not. And I'm like, well, I had been admitted to a PhD program. I'm like, well, here's my resignation. And I'm like, you know what, Jeff, we have this thing, like after the Civil War called the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? The 13th Amendment does away with slavery. We don't have, you can't refuse to accept my resignation. This is the way it's going to be. But that sort of attitude of you work hard is deeply ingrained in a lot of the American psyche, and it's not necessarily ingrained in other societies. And ethics, this is a huge thing. In the United States, we have something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits companies from engaging in what is bribery. And other countries sort of expect this. I mean, if you want to do business in that country, you're going to pay bribes to government officials to establish your business. That is antithetical to our way of thinking as a result of having gone through sort of the Tammany Hall and the abuses of the system that we had in the first part of the 20th century, the late 19th and early 20th century. We developed this sort of good government model where that's just not acceptable, and we've imposed it on companies. And American companies actually argue that this hinders us in our ability to compete with foreign companies that don't have those kinds of ethical and legal requirements. What is the political and legal environment in the country that you're going to go into? In many countries, not in the United States, but in many countries, if you want to do business in that country, you have to have a partner that has to own the majority share of the business. You can't have a wholly owned foreign, sort of company. You have to partner with somebody in that company, in that country, that has a majority share. So what are the political and legal environments? How stable is that political and legal environment that you're going into? After the fall of the Soviet Union, all kinds of American businesses and American business people went into Russia and started doing business. And Russia initially was, after the fall of the Soviet Union, sort of a highly democratic country. They're not now. And I would suggest to you that if you're an American company that's doing business in Russia right now, you're going to be facing some real uncomfortable business climates as a result of the fact that Russia has now invaded Ukraine, and the Americans are pretty overwhelmingly supporting, without actually engaging in the war, the Ukrainians. I mean, our president has now said that not only is Vladimir Putin committing war crimes, like this is a huge deal to call a leader of another nation a war criminal, but has now said that it's not only war crimes, but they're engaging in genocide. I don't know that the behavior of the Russians it clearly constitutes a war crime. But when you talk about genocide, I think that's a term that we shouldn't use lightly. I mean, that involves the deliberate and targeted destruction of an entire ethnic group, right? If you went back in time before sort of the birth of modern cultural ethnic studies, people talked about race. Race, as we now understand it, is no longer really a useful term, right? There are very few people who you could say were purely this or that, but we certainly have cultural ethnic categories, and to say that they're wiping out an entire ethnicity, I'm not sure meets the definition. I mean, that's what genocide is. It's the attempt to eliminate. In Nazi Germany, it was an attempt to eliminate all inferior races. Again, race not being, at the time, people talked about race. It's not a particularly helpful term given that most of us are a mix of lots of things. So there's one race, maybe the human race, but we certainly have cultural ethnicities. And I think to say that that's genocide, what they're doing in Ukraine, may be a stretch, but our president has said that now, that the Russians are engaged in ethnic cleansing in that country. That makes it real difficult. McDonald's, Coca-Cola had to make really hard choices about whether or not they were going to continue their businesses inside of Russia. McDonald's has chosen not to continue. They've closed their restaurants, which that's a huge loss, right? So what are the political and legal, and how stable are those political and legal environments? When Castro took over Cuba, all kinds of Americans, he nationalized all of the property in Cuba, and all sorts of American business people lost their investments in that country and never got it back. So how stable is that environment? So there's a couple of ways that you can go about engaging in global marketing. Obviously, advantages of taking a global perspective with regard to your marketing are that you get economies of scale and you lower the costs. You have the ability to exploit goods on a worldwide basis. Coca-Cola is probably the best example of this. When President Nixon opened up communist China, what was the first product we exported under the Carter administration to communist China? It was Coca-Cola, right? Coca-Cola is the iconic American brand, and it is far superior for those of you who like Pepsi, which is a communist inferior product. It's sort of the iconic American brand, and it's sold all over the world in exactly the same form as it is in the United States for the most part, right? But lots of goods you can't do that with. You can have a consistent image if you take a global marketing perspective. And that's good because consumers form an image in their mind of what a product is, and you need to be consistent in that. And if you're not, they'll form their own image and attributes of your product that may not be what you want. And it obviously simplifies coordination and control, but there are problems with just sort of taking this global perspective like Coca-Cola does. There are differences in needs, usage, and media and legal restrictions. So when McDonald's went into Western Europe, a lot of the nations in Western Europe have restrictions on how you can advertise, and you can't advertise directly to children. So one of the most popular parts of McDonald's, and they've started to downplay this in this country, but when I was a kid growing up, was the Happy Meal. And with every Happy Meal you get, I mean, one of the reasons the kids love the Happy Meal is it's, like nothing but saturated fat and sugar. But one of the reasons that, I loved it and most kids love it is that not only do you get the meal and the French fries, but you also get a toy. Right, exactly. And that toy is enormously popular. They generally have, some tie to something that's going on culturally in terms of like Disney movies or whatever. You can't do that in other countries. That's just a violation of their ideas of marketing to children. You can't market to children the way you can in the United States, where we have this First Amendment freedom, which really gives corporations a huge ability to engage in what other countries view as ethically problematic, persuasion. Because other countries really look at children as being a vulnerable subset of the population that you shouldn't be marketing to. And so there are all these kinds of restrictions. There are all kinds of restrictions. For example, when I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, McDonald's historically has got these huge golden arches that they, put 40 feet in the air so that you can see it from a great distance. Can't do that. Like other countries have these ideas about aesthetics that are radically different from ours in terms of what you can do, like with billboards and marketing. In thinking about this, you have to decide whether or not you're going to have a centralized approach, a decentralized approach, or a combination. And there are advantages and disadvantages, obviously, to each of these. Centralization means that you get a lot of ability to control your message and stick with that and be consistent. But there are problems with that. And again, in terms of translating and marketing in different areas, the marketing may not go the way you think it does. So in terms of agency selection, are you going to choose an agency that has both domestic and international offices, or an agency that is affiliated with agencies in other countries that allows for, sort of a greater diversity, or select an agency for each national market? Obviously, if you have an agency with both domestic and international offices, you have this ability to control the message. You're consistent in the message, but it can lead to problems in terms of other countries don't necessarily respond to the same kind of marketing appeals that we do in the United States. Whereas if you have an agency that's affiliated with other agencies, those are going to be largely staffed by people in those locations. They're going to understand the unique aspects of that country, or even more so, selecting an agency in each national market that you want to enter. The disadvantage of this is, of course, that you can lose control of your message if you don't understand what it is that they're promoting. Creative decisions become important in this. And the media selection, the way people choose to hear about your product and service, is different. In the developed world, where we are constantly bombarded with advertisements. And one of the things that's interesting about marketing is that it is a pervasive discipline. You can't escape it. It's not like looking at a Picasso and deciding that he's I think Picasso's a nut, and I don't generally like his artwork. That you just don't like it. That's not the way marketing works. Like you're constantly bombarded with this. But how we choose to receive those kinds of marketing persuasions varies from country to country. In this country, you all can't fathom your life without this device. You've grown up with this device being part of your sort of cultural experience. When my brother had children, I tried to convince him early on. I mean, like, he and his wife are both highly educated. My brother has a post-doctoral degree from NYU in taxation. He's an attorney. My mother wanted both a doctor and a lawyer, and she ended up with 2 lawyers. And then she's sort of bitter about that. But, he has like these little kids. And I was like, Raul, he started, at a very early age, these little kids started picking up his phone or his wife's phone. And I said, there's some evidence to suggest that introducing children to technology at a very young age leads to, again, this was at the time, I'm sure there's now counter evidence to this, but leads to attention deficit disorder, right? And I'm convinced from my own experience that this is true. I can tell you that when I was an undergraduate, going to class was sort of an entertaining experience for me because I had a cell phone in college, but at that point in time, cell phones were like this bag that you carried around. I mean, I realized, they weighed like 8 pounds, and using them was enormously expensive, and it didn't work very well. You sort of had to be like on top of the hill and like in Guthrie to use my cell phone. If you were in various parts, like now, we're just totally frustrated if we don't have full bars everywhere, right? And we're having this problem. I'm convinced that this has led to adult onset ADD in myself, because we're now constantly, again, when our friends say something, we're instantly fact checking them on Google or looking up what they're talking about. And so we all have this tendency to turn to our devices. And I told my brother, like, there's some evidence to suggest that early use of cell phones is problematic and can lead to ADD. There's some evidence, for example, to suggest that the use of computers by elementary school children is problematic. Lots of schools now are giving, my brother lives in a very wealthy area of Dallas, in Plano, and the school district has some of the highest scoring tests of any place in the nation, which is why he chose to go to Plano when he moved back from New York. Why he chose to live in Plano was because they had great public schools, and they give kids at a very early age. And as a result of COVID, they started giving every kid in the district a laptop. Well, there is some evidence, again, to suggest that this is problematic in terms of deep learning, because kids learn at a very early age to keyboard and to use the laptop. And I noticed this when I was in law school. I had a laptop and I took it to law school. I was one of the few people that did this, and I could take notes. I could sit there and listen to what the professor was saying, and I could type as fast. I can type 120 words per minute accurately, as fast as they were talking. But I realized that I wasn't really getting the material the way I was when I was an undergraduate and I didn't have a laptop, because when you take notes on a piece of paper in a spiral notebook, Mr. Morris, right? You have to think about what I'm saying and put it down into sort of a shorthand. You cannot possibly, even if you write cursive, which, again, I'm horrified by this, but they no longer teach cursive in public education. Right? Why would you need cursive? You've got a laptop. You can type it. Like, kids are not going to have to do this. One of the things that cursive writing did was it made it easy for you to write quickly, but you can't write every single word that I say down. If you can type really, really quickly, you can type every word I say really, really quickly and not really think about it, right? So what this does is it's a translation issue, right? So you're having to think about what I'm saying and take down just sort of the bare bones of it. And so this leads to greater in-depth learning than it does in a society in which we can just all keyboard. All of this goes back to, like, in other countries, we don't think much about this in the United States because everybody has these devices. But not everybody in other countries have the same luxury that we have. In the developing world, how they select media is very different. Nobody actually reads newspapers anymore or magazines, except, sort of the elderly. They still have magazines at the checkout stand. And how many people used to, like, actually, you would see a cover and people would actually pick it up based on whoever the star was on the cover of People magazine or whatever. And now no one under, like 85 does that. Now, thank God for the magazines, there's a whole lot of 85-year-olds out there as people are living longer and longer. But, I used to see people at the grocery stores, they're standing there in line and they're waiting for the checkout, which we don't wait anymore because we got self-checkouts at most places. Used to be there would be lines at the grocery store. And people would sit there and they would look at the magazines and they would pick it up. And because they picked it up, now they're going to buy the magazine so that they can get, the latest gossip on whoever it is. We don't consume media that way for the most part in the United States. But in other countries where we're not all constantly texting, they do. So what are the media selection? How is it that you're going to reach people in these other areas where they don't necessarily have 5G and all these kinds of technologies, right? So media selection becomes an important issue. Sales promotion. This is growing due to the transfer of promotional concepts and techniques from the United States and highly industrialized countries to other places. So sales promotion is one of the areas that's increasing. Public relations. All companies that engage in globalization need to do this. They need to deal with local governments, media, trade associations, and the public in order to do business in those countries. And so public relations is enormously important in foreign places, particularly in places where local businesses and local companies may feel threatened by multinational corporations that come in. Again, going back to the KFC example in Japan, they had to go in and ask because, this is one of those customs where they tend to prefer their own sort of food and cultures as opposed to outsourced or Americanized, companies that are coming in. Digital and social media are a major issue. Many of the platforms that we use in the United States to get our advertising out to people are banned. Facebook in China and Twitter are not, not the major or dominant platforms because they have lots of issues in terms of the legality. So this is one of those examples of how these things intertwine. We think of them as being silos when we talk about them, but all of these concepts sort of interrelate to each other. So what's the legal and political regulatory environment with regard to things like this? One of the things that's interesting that happened in China before it happened in the United States was the ability of small merchants to take mobile pay. So they don't have the same platforms that we have, but they did have, the country as a whole has adopted these sort of devices, and the ability in China to take mobile pay and to pay by phone was much faster in adoption than, for example, in the United States, where we still have a lot of people that can't use that. We have a number of people, a huge percentage actually of our country, that are what we call unbankable. How many of you have opened a bank account recently? And you had to
I have opened an account within my own bank account.
Okay. If you go and open a bank account now, historically banks to open a bank account didn't run a credit report on you. They do now. And they want to make sure that you are, a good risk. In the past, they didn't do that. But in other countries, they have adopted, in particular like China, the ability to pay by mobile device much faster than we are because they have, less restrictions in terms of what's bankable and not. All right, any questions about international advertising? So I'm going to talk just for a minute about the Imc Plan. The way I have organized this, historically in the past, before I taught this course, the instructor chose the professor chose a company and everybody worked on the same company. And that led to problems, which I tried to tell them when I was associate general counsel, this is gonna lead to problems with regard to copyright. You have a copyright in anything you produce, right? Like the minute you produce it, you get copyright. Now, how valuable that copyright is questionable. But as a result of that, what I have done is I have allowed you to select any company that you want to use, and I'm not gonna give the plans, obviously, to anybody. It's just for this class project. I'm not gonna sell those plans or whatever to the company. That would be a violation of your copyright, and I don't wanna do that. So it's just for you, it's, just for this class project. So you can select basically two types of companies. You can select a local company, one that you're probably familiar with in terms of who you work for example, would be an ideal sort of company, or you can select a nationwide or global company in terms of doing your IMC plan. The advantage of selecting a publicly traded company is that publicly traded companies have to file these things called 10Qs and 10Ks, right? Which give a detailed breakdown sort of how they are going about business, right? It gives you lots of information in terms of how much they have to spend on their budget for advertising and promotion, and where they do it. And you also have the ability to see, pretty easily where they're advertising, right? Historically speaking, something that occurred earlier in the season where big companies all wanted to have Super Bowl ads. And people who don't even like football watch the Super Bowl, not because they want to watch the Super Bowl or they care about the teams that are playing, but because they watch the ad. The most creative ads were always launched at the Super Bowl. That's now that they have pre-launches of these ads, it's not nearly as much of a sort of thrill as it used to be to watch the ads, but there were very creative ads. So you get a national company, you have all of this ability to look at what they've done and maybe suggest that they should do something different from their ads. Budweiser, for example, comes to mind. Enormously creative in the past Super Bowl ads, right? The horse, they did a series of Super Bowl ads that were really creative and sort of tugged at your heartstrings about the dog and the Budweiser horse. Do you all remember these with great music in the background? I'm not sure it sold Budweiser, but it made everybody feel good. And, I guess it built brand recognition and equity. So that's an advantage. The disadvantage of doing that, of course, is that there's a voluminous amount of information out there that you're going to have to sort through to come up with your marketing plan. Students in this class often ask me, how many pages should the plan be? I can't tell you that because I'm letting you choose between, obviously if you have a national company, you have a lot more access to information and you're going to have a variety of media to select from. Whereas if you choose the company that you may work for as an intern or that you have a job at, they may not have the same access to resources that Budweiser has in terms of developing television, radio, the whole plethora of media that are available. So I can't tell you, you have to meet all of the elements of the plan, for example, having the executive summary, identifying the target market and things like that, right? So I can't tell you how many pages it should be. The advantage of doing a local company, particularly one that you may work for, is that you can actually talk to the owners and figure out what their needs and their problems are. For example, if you did my company, which nobody has ever done, the Stone Line Inn, we used to advertise enormously heavily in newspapers in Oklahoma City, in Wichita, because Wichita is even more boring than Oklahoma City. And people like are desperate for something to do in Wichita and Tulsa, and they would come to the Stone Line Inn to do a murder mystery. Since we have been on Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures, we do absolutely no advertising anymore. We have a website that's really old and out of date, and we're still booked every single weekend because every time Ghost Adventures replays an episode that involves the Stone Line Inn, which I've been told is their most popular replay, is the episode that involves my company. And they replay it a lot. We get thousands of calls, and now we have, like this reputation, and people by word of mouth are coming back and coming to the Stone Line Inn. So you have the ability to talk to owners and figure that sort of thing out if you select a local company. If you select a local company and you don't work there and you don't have access, or they won't tell you the information, you're going to have to make it believable, right? You can't select the Stone Line Inn and say, well, the budget for this is going to be $1.1 million, right? Like we don't have 1.1. So it has to have some sort of foundation in reality. So you need to think about those kinds of issues. What is realistic for a local company versus Tesla, which has just enormous amounts of money. And even though they have these enormous amounts of money and access to resources, I haven't, does Tesla actually have like I haven't seen a television ad for Tesla. Do they? I mean,
Not really.
Which is kind of odd that they don't. So you sort of have to think about these things. Again, like I can't give you a page requirement. You just have to meet all of the elements. And what I look for is the quality of sort of the arguments that you make in favor of your plan. Fundamentally, this is an argumentative paper. And what do I mean by argumentative paper? If you look at my YouTube channel, I have a whole lecture in my marketing ethics class on argumentation, which I don't have time to do in this class because of the sheer number of chapters that we have to cover. But it may be helpful to you to look at that, because fundamentally what you're doing is you are making a proposal that you think that your argument for these things is the best course for whichever company you choose. It is fundamentally an argumentative paper. It is not, you have to make decisions in this paper, which means you have to make an argument that this is the course of action that should be taken. And that's what you're fundamentally going to be required to do. Another reason that I tell you this is because students a lot of times want me, again, to tell them how many pages this has to be. And when you get out in the real world of work, one of the things that we try to do is to have experiences that will mimic what you will do in the real world. And so developing a marketing plan or an IMC plan are things that you as a marketer will be asked to do in the real world. And your boss is not going to give you a page limit. They're not going to say, I want you to give me a 15-page proposal on how we should go and sell. For example, when I was in the corporate world, our new Advancer, that was one of the products that I did a trademark for. We came up with this product for higher education. Historically, our company had worked in K-12, and we came up with a higher education platform, how to sell Advancer to colleges and universities. That's just not something that he did. He wanted you to figure out how to sell it. And, the page numbers was irrelevant to whether or not we successfully launched that. So this is an exercise in your ability to fulfill the requirements of the plan qualitatively, right? So there's a rubric, it's in the syllabus, tells you all of the details. I give you an example of a plan. The example I give you is sort of a, sort of C+ level example. And students oftentimes, again, will say, well, if you won't tell me the page number, what's an A level paper look like? Well, I can't, like, you need to figure these kinds of things out, right? This is a senior level class. You need to sort of figure it out and come up with something that is got some basis in reality. All right? Any questions about that?
I'm
Yes.
pretty sure I already asked you this, but so we're writing this from, we can choose whether to write it from like an external perspective or like an internal perspective.
you
like,
could.
So like, I would be the one working for the company and.
Or you could be working for an advertising agency that's making a pitch to
To them.
the company to buy your, services and plan. All right? Okay, well, next week we won't meet, or the following week, because I give you those two to work on your IMC plans. If you have any questions, please feel free to text me. You've got my phone number. I respond to texts fairly quickly. If you email me, I don't know, it could be days, because like stuff gets lost in the voluminous amounts of email that I receive every day from vendors. All right. Have a good morning.